Okay, it's recording.
Okay.
Shall I get started?
Yeah, go ahead and get started.
Okay, so this is a first for me, and we'll just go through this the best we can. I wish we were in person. I miss that interaction with all of you, but with things how they are, I'm grateful we have the technology to do this. So we'll go ahead and go. All right, so what I want to talk about is what is turf, and what is it actually, and do we need it? Preparation and establishment, how do I have a healthy lawn from the get-go? Talk a little bit about cool season turf, which is what we normally grow here. Briefly on some warm season grasses that are grown in the warmer areas of the United States, and then maintenance. And if we get time, we'll cover some problems that we have commonly with lawn, some insects and some diseases. So historically, in Europe, especially England, turf was
Hey, Ton,
grown by
I
the
don't know if we can
wealthy.
see your
Yeah.
screen.
Okay. We
Let me
might need
see.
to.
Unless I'm looking at it wrong.
Class members, can you see the screen, or is it messed up?
It's only showing you. It's not showing the presentation anymore.
Okay. All right. This is what I'm going to do, Mike. I'm just going to pull all monitors and go from my laptop.
Okay.
Okay. Let's try this again. Can you see it now?
No, you might have to initiate a new share.
Okay.
Screen share.
All right. I'm just working from the laptop. Let's go screen share. And this one, share. Okay. What are you seeing now?
Now we can see your presentation.
That's good. Is it actually, is it in presentation form?
Not yet.
Okay. Let me open PowerPoint. Minimize this. Oh, Zoom is driving me nuts. Let's just do this. The chat screen is in front of PowerPoint. I can't get rid of it.
Yeah, it's going to be weird. I'll monitor the
Okay.
chat.
Okay, how's this? No, I got rid of it. All right,
Okay.
Can you see the full presentation now?
Lower right-hand corner.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Go to the lower right-hand corner and press on the screen, like a screen that you would show a movie on. That'll give you the full picture.
Okay, I think I've got it to where I want it. If you can see the presentation, I'm leaving things alone.
Yep.
Okay.
We can see it.
Okay, good. All right, so it's scrolling through fine now?
Yep.
Okay. There we go. So.
Well, you can't see it.
So now I lost. Let's see. Share content.
Let's see. I'm going to mute everyone.
Yeah, you can mute everybody.
I don't see the button to do those, so let's just get on with it. If your mics are on for now, if you would mute them, besides Mike, I'd appreciate it. Okay, here we go. So.
Because it's not the right number.
So it's Linda. It's Linda. If you right click on her, on her window, you get an option that says to mute.
Okay.
Oh, is it me?
There we are.
Okay. All right. There we go. All right. Here we go. All right. Apologies, everyone, for technical difficulties. All right. So we grow turf for a lot of different reasons, but historically, turf was grown in Europe in 16, 17, 1800s by the wealthy. And we saw that and wanted to emulate the wealthy. And so turf became a status symbol, and it's something that a lot of people wanted because of that. We use it because it tolerates a lot of foot traffic. There's no other plant that will tolerate a football or a soccer game regularly, plus practices. We use turf for weed control because, again, in the right situations can outcompete a lot of things. And then even though we use water to do it, temperatures on actively growing grass during the summer can be 20 degrees cooler than the ambient air temperature. So, okay, there we go. And just to show you the scale of how much turf we grow more turf than cotton, barley, or rice in the United States. I mean, it's a major crop and it's a billion-dollar industry. And so there's just a lot of things that go into it. So in the late 90s, and I need to see if I can find a new study on this, but in the late 90s, the average homeowner spent $500 a year on yard equipment and chemicals, and then 35% of us spent over $500, and that included lawn maintenance. 55% applied lawn and garden chemicals to their lawn, and then 75% applied fertilizer. And so, in industry, if I owned a fertilizer company and I knew almost 75% of US homeowners applied fertilizer that had lawns, I mean, it's a big industry. So the problem we're running into here is that historically our population wasn't that great, and we had lots of available water in the reservoirs in the mountains, and it wasn't like we could just water, but we could have very green lawns, and we had more than was sufficient in most years, and having a lawn, it was cultural. The average Kentucky bluegrass lawn, which 98% of our lawns here in northern Utah are Kentucky bluegrass, the Kentucky bluegrass, to stay green in the summer and in the wild it doesn't, but just to stay green, Kentucky bluegrass requires between 25 and 30 inches of irrigation from late May into October to keep it green. Utah residents average about 50 inches of water that we put down on our lawns, and this is mainly due to just flat out overwatering. We have places where the sprinklers don't hit as well, so we increase the run times to make the brown spots green, pests and diseases, and then we don't really monitor our sprinkler clocks that well. So this is a home up in Farmington, and I think there's probably about an acre of turf, and if you look in the background, the neighbors have a lot. And unfortunately, I think that these days are numbered to where we can just willy-nilly have grass everywhere because we like the look, because turf requires so much water. It doesn't mean we can't have it, and especially if you've got kids or garden parties, let's plan that into the landscapes. But this is going to be coming to an end in the next 20 years or so, just because of the number of people that we have moving in or that are becoming part of our economy. So in a lot of situations, turf is not needed. And there's research out there showing that well-maintained landscape beds require about a third less maintenance time-wise than turf, and they require about a third less expense once they're installed. Now, this is including the use of bark mulch and maybe a pre-emergent, and it seems counterintuitive because, I just run my mower over my lawn once a week. Well, taking all that time into account, those shred beds save a lot of water, and the landscape beds do, and they also are less time and less money to maintain. So one thing that over the last 20 or 30 years with the Green Revolution and just people becoming more aware of what our environment is, this is our foothills in the spring after, May and June when there's still some groundwater and things, but we do live in a beautiful state. And there's been a push to more mimic what our yards look like and match it with the natural environment to create more of a unique look, because a lot of our yards, with the grass and the trees, you can't distinguish if our yard was, if you were to plop it down in Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon, or Dayton, Ohio, it would look the same and you wouldn't know. And you're like, hey, we're in Utah. That's a unique thing. And so we're really trying to push toward something that's beautiful, and we don't have to have sagebrush. And as Mike has taught, cow skulls everywhere, and we can still have a nice yard, but we do have a unique state that I think that we could really do well with. Now, one mistake that we do make is we associate wildlands with something like the high Uintas. And these areas are more just islands or pockets, and the Uintas can get up to 50 or 60 inches of precipitation a year, where the Wasatch Front averages around 15 to 17. And then if you go out toward Tooele, and especially the West Desert, it may experience only 5 to 7 inches. And so this should not be considered the standard stereotypical Utah landscape, to where there are more islands, not trying to mimic Dolly Parton, but islands in the sky, which they are, surrounded by much drier areas. So preparation, on our preparation, one thing that we should be doing is soil testing, which we'll talk more about later. But that soil test should look at the salinity, because a lot of our population is going to the west and south sides of the county. And with that going that way, a lot of those soils that were never farmed weren't farmed because they weren't suitable. And it wasn't just that there wasn't water available. If it was good soil, we would have built a canal. And so a lot of those lands have just been used for grazing because they are too salty. So we need to look for things like heavy clay. What kind of drainage do we have? And then we need to plot out our yards. I really like the local scapes theme that we'll have in a week or two with Sandy Vernon, but it wants you to put everything to your yard first, and the last thing you plop in is your turf. And so what that does is that it minimizes the amount of grass you need, and it helps with saving a lot of water. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of preparation as we go into this. A lot of times, with Mike or JD or other USU horticulturists, we will go take a look at more commercial properties, whether it's universities or, a landscaper called and said, we come look at this school. But what happens a lot of times is we'll go look at a situation 5 to 10 years after the fact, and things are really struggling because they didn't do a very good job on prepping the soil and didn't do a very good job on installing the irrigation system so that everywhere was covered evenly. And with this, when you first install your yard, it doesn't really, a lot of times these lack of preparation problems won't show up for a number of years. So, and it could be 5 to 10 years down the road before you actually see anything. So there was one situation to where JD and I got roped into doing a favor for one of the vice presidents. We looked at a home in Logan, and JD just said, 5 years after the fact, how do you tell somebody that their crappy lawn can be traced back to somebody not doing a very good job on preparation? So here's a USU soil test, and is fairly average, the pH, and that's how acidic or alkaline the soil is. 7.64 is fairly normal. The salinity is below 2, and the phosphorus is high, and it has adequate potassium. So what this soil test says is that turf and other common landscape plants and gardens should grow fine in this particular soil. These tests sometimes are a little hard to interpret, but what they will tell you is they will flag if you're too salty or have nutrients that are too high or too low. And then when you are in doubt, you can call over to our office and talk to Meredith or me or Mike. Okay, so one thing that often happens is people will want to haul in topsoil, and it's just not a good thing to do. And we'll cover that in a little bit more later. But if you can afford it and you have a schedule that will allow it, the best time to put in mulch or compost, that should say compost, is in the fall, to where you will till that in and let it sit all winter and break down and do its thing. And then you might be able to do another inch or so in the spring. You don't need to, but you want to get that incorporated about 6 inches deep. And then when you plant your seed and everything's raked out and ready to go, you know that you've done things right. If you're putting about a 1/2 inch footprint in the soil, that's about the ideal texture of the soil to allow the seed to germinate. So lawn preparation, this is my front yard, and I have lots of cobble to pebble-sized rocks in my soil, and I'm always preaching to people, don't haul in topsoil. And so I've been doing my due diligence on lawn prep. And so in my front yard that's about 20 by 30, I raked 3 cubic yards of rocks out. And then when I was done, I went and got some compost and raked it in and just practice what I preached. It was a lot of hard work, but I was glad I did. So here's the finished product. And it was funny. I put the seed down and got everything ready. That night, we had a 100-year rain event, and it actually, in some areas, grew to about 4 to 6 inch deep channels through my soil. And when everything germinated, it looked kind of like a butte, and it was funny. And I had to do a lot of fixing, but I did do everything right. Okay, so irrigation systems, make sure to bury your pipes deep enough, and make sure that when you put the soil back in, you might want to let it sit for a few days. You may even water where your trench was, because that soil will usually settle 2 or 3 inches, and you'll probably need to put a little bit more soil over the top. Okay, I moved some soil around here. I had some, you can't really see it in the picture, but this is a low area that, as I was trying to do my leveling, in some areas I had too much soil, so I moved it to another part of the yard. And I tried to stick with my same soil. We've talked about the perched water tables and drainage problems, and so if you can stick with the soil you have, you're usually better off. There are situations to where the soil's just flat out too rocky to work. This is on the bench in Payson or Santaquin, I think in Santaquin. And you notice the soil in that picture has lots of rocks, and there's no way that you could run a rototiller through there. And so in this situation, what I would personally do, because the soil is fairly well drained, is I would get all the big rocks off I could, and at least haul in 2 to maybe probably 3 inches of topsoil to put over the top. Ideally, you do 6, but that gets really expensive and really hard. So this is a situation to where there's just no way around it. You're going to have to haul in some topsoil to probably get some turf down, whether you're doing seed or sod. Okay. So what I like to do is water my weeds. And so I'll get my yard ready, and I'll go out if I have time and irrigate it once, and that tests the sprinkling system to make sure that everything's working. And I'll wait for a week to 10 days and see what germinates, and then I can go out with a weed torch or just lightly cultivate those weeds out. And after I've done that, I'll put my grass seed down, and that will reduce some of the weeds that would have germinated with my grass seed and helps the seed get established a little better. Some other things you can do is run that whole irrigation system to test it, make sure that everything's working. It'll settle the soil a bit. It'll show you if you have low spots where the soil was too puffy. And if you put compost down in the fall, sometimes that decomposes a little bit, and you may have to add a little bit of soil in those areas. And so if you can, it's actually good to run that sprinkling system before you plant. Some other things with sprinkling systems, and I don't want to get too much into this, but anybody that's been in horticulture, worked for garden centers, worked landscaping, immediately knows that there's water pressure problems, and the first thing that needs to be checked is the filter, or the filters. Right here, this is a situation to where this guy hadn't cleaned his filters for a couple of years, but he kept hiring people to come out and doing this and that, spending lots of money trying to get new sprinkler heads. So when he went on vacation, me and a buddy went over and looked at his filters, and they were filthy. We cleaned them out, and then everything worked fine, and we actually got his sprinkling system going, and his grass was green when he got back. And he had the gall to come over and be like, you know how my grass had those rings and you said it was irrigation? Well, it was actually humate. That fixed it. And I never told him that me and our other neighbor had fixed his sprinkling system. He thought this was maybe a disease, and disease just doesn't form like that. You know, that's too concentric around a sprinkler head, and that's very easy to diagnose. Okay, planting. The cheapest way to go is with seed. The seed is a little bit tricky, and I would recommend only doing it in the spring and fall. And when you do it, there's some steps to it that we'll cover. Hydroseeding is very useful because they usually put a paper mulch in there that has a weak form of Elmer's glue. It's called a tackifier that kind of holds things together. It makes watering a little bit more easy. A lot of times the hydroseeders will actually pre-germinate the seed so that it comes up a lot more quickly when they spray it through. And then the easiest thing to do, and I shouldn't say the easiest, but the instant gratification, is sod. And given all these options, honestly, if I've got the money, I'm doing sod, just because you water it in for a few months, it roots in, and you're done. And if you do it correctly, you're not dealing with weed problems that you do when you do seed or hydroseed. Now, one thing I will say is that if you think that your hydroseeder or your seed company had lots of weed seed, and that's their fault that weeds came up all over the place, those were already in the soil, and it wasn't the hydroseeder or the seed company's fault. Okay, so there's lots of different mixes you can use. Back 50 or 60 years ago, it was really common to do a 1-to-1-to-1 mix of Kentucky bluegrass, perennial rye, and red fescue. But what we have found is that over 10 or 20 years, those grasses actually separate out. And it's not super obvious, but your lawn will take on kind of a patchy look to where the grasses grow at their best. And so you'll get more fescues in the shady areas, a little bit more rye and heavier traffic areas in Kentucky bluegrass elsewhere. And so we've gone to more using an 80-20 mix with Kentucky bluegrass and perennial rye. And what will happen is, theoretically, the Kentucky bluegrass chokes the rye out. And so we're not just using one cultivar, we use several cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass now, so that you get some genetic resistance to diseases. Some of them might be more drought tolerant, some of them may be more shade tolerant. And so it's almost like dogs, and I've used this example in the past on these cultivars, to where you have Canis familiaris, which is our house dog, but you can have poodles and you can have labs and you can have all sorts of different dogs, but they're all the same species. And it's kind of like that in the plant world, to where with the Kentucky bluegrass, a lot of these cultivars look very similar, but they have different genetic characteristics that help them benefit the lawn in different ways. Okay, seeding is the least expensive and the longest wait. You have a lot of choices, and a cool season turf, we generally recommend around 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet. If you're seeding it, you actually can go 6 or 7 and have it fill in a little more quickly. Seed is usually fairly inexpensive. And when I do my seeding, I sometimes will double the rate just to have it fill in more quickly, because my wife's like, why don't you just go buy sod? And I'm like, honey, I'm too cheap. I want to do seed. And so to get a faster lawn, I double the rate, and it doesn't hurt anything to do that. So on the seed, the best time to do this is in the spring or the fall when it's cooler. And what I will personally do is get the lawn prepped, and then I very carefully get the seed down using a broadcast spreader, and then I'll go in and by hand, I will spread about 1/4 to 1/3 of an inch of finely ground compost or peat moss over the top of the seed. I do not rake the seed in. When I do that, I always you can see where I swept the rake, and there's holes and then pockets and things like that. And so I'm just not talented enough to do that. And so I put the seed down, and even though I'm walking on it, I'm very careful not to kick my feet. So I'm kicking dirt up. And then I just cover that with about 1/3 of an inch of compost. Then I'll lightly water it in, and I'll just water it for 5 minutes, stop, water for 5 minutes, stop, until the point I can get the soil saturated with water. And then even in the spring, I'll go out several times a day and check it, because the edges usually dry out more than the middle. And I keep it wet. And by the time that compost starts to work its way into the soil a bit and maybe decompose a bit, it's about 10 days to 2 weeks down the road. And oftentimes by then I'm seeing some grass germinate. Okay, seed on slopes. If you try to do seed on slope, it oftentimes washes away because you have water running down. It's really difficult. And even if you did sod or something, you can run into some problems with too much water running off and that sod going dormant in the summer because it doesn't get enough water and eventually dying out, and other things that are more drought tolerant moving in. So you need to be a little careful with that. If you're doing slopes, sod or hydroseeding are usually a better option. So Kentucky bluegrass is our most common grass. It's dark green, it's soft, it's green from late March into November. And a lot of times, if you've got small kids, because of how green it is and how soft it is, it's an ideal turf for kids to play on. And when it's accused of not being very drought tolerant, it's not. But remember, we have a tendency to overwater. So in the summer, it slows down just because it doesn't like the heat and it can't photosynthesize well. And so it does slow down during the summer a little bit. Okay, perennial ryegrass. Ryegrass has some advantages and disadvantages. It is actually a very soft dark green grass. And if you've ever golfed, about half of the golf courses in the Intermountain West have ryegrass fairways because it's very tolerant of foot traffic and very easy to repair, but you need to know what you're doing, because this is actually a bunch grass that doesn't spread out very quickly if you don't seed over the top of it every 2 or 3 years. So you'd go in every couple of years with 1 pound of seed per 1,000 square feet to keep it thick. It has a tendency to become just a little bit clumpy over the years, and so it does need to be reinvigorated, so to speak. The golf courses like it because if you are like me and when you golf and you golf more grass than the actual golf ball, it's easy to repair the divots because it germinates so quickly and establishes so fast. But as a homeowner, both Mike and I have perennial ryegrass in areas of our yards, and even though I will maintain mine, I would never do it again just because it's just a little bit harder to maintain than fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would agree. Last fall, I actually overseeded mine with a perennial rye Kentucky bluegrass mix because this perennial rye in my lawn isn't repairing itself very well at all.
No, if you get a 6-inch hole and don't reseed it, it'll be a full year for it to repair itself.
Well, it's longer than that. So, and at Thanksgiving Point, they primarily use a ryegrass mix. and that helps prevent the lawn from spreading so much into the flower beds. But they use what they use there is an 80-20. So it's an 80% ryegrass with a 20% Kentucky bluegrass.
That
And
Kentucky bluegrass is there to repair itself if they get
it's just
divots
there
or
to help.
something.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a dominant one, so they don't have as much problems with it, like being invasive, but it does help keep it fuller.
Yeah. So thank you. Let's see. It stays green as long as Kentucky bluegrass, but I've just had some challenges with it, and it's a lawn that I wouldn't recommend for the average homeowner. So this was mine after about a year after that rainstorm I told you about, and you can see all the divots in it still. I was supposed to be watching my kids on a Sunday when my wife was taking the nap, and I was doing a good job of watching them, by the way. I saw him do every bit of that, going swimming in the sprinkler with his church clothes. But anyway, you can see that it is pretty grass, but it is one that it just takes forever to repair itself. And if you get any disease in it, like snow mold, you've really almost just got to reseed those areas that died out.
Hey, Ton, I just wanted to add just about perennial ryegrass. It is a good grass, and it actually overall probably has the best wear tolerance of any of the grasses because it's so fibrous. The grasses inside or the fibers inside the blades of grass are really fibrous. So having said that, in order for it to really look good, the mower blades have to be really sharp or it just shreds the tops of the grasses because those fibers are pretty durable.
Yeah, and that's why golf courses use it. It's actually outside of the Intermountain West really commonly used on sports fields for that reason, but they know how to manage it. So thank you. So if I could redo my entire yard, I would actually do my whole yard in turf type tall fescue. Mike, may have different opinions on this, and I'm not saying you need to run out and plant turf type tall fescue. My lawn, I've got Kentucky bluegrass, rye, and this particular turf. And this one has been the lowest maintenance. It stays green. It's soft. It's not quite as fine. The blades aren't as fine as Kentucky bluegrass or the rye, but the kids don't know. And it's just been the easiest one to maintain. I've got mine trained to where in the middle of the summer I can go 7 to 10 days between irrigations and it stays green. It's just, this is the one that if I redid everything I would use because it's just such a durable, nice lawn. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, there's a question from Dave about prepping the lawn before overseeding. What you would need to do to prepare it for overseeding.
Aerate maybe. You can aerate in the spring and fall fairly heavily, and that's hollow core aeration. And what will happen is a lot of that seed will work its way down into the thatch more easily or past the thatch and germinate. And you would do that every spring and fall for 2 or 3 years. And let's say you had ryegrass and were wanting to transition to Kentucky bluegrass. Over that 2 or 3 years, the bluegrass would just continually become more and more dominant. It would never completely take over, but that's how I do it. Okay, the fescues may require light reseeding every 3 years or so, but there's a lot of newer types that are either stoloniferous, that means that they spread out by the runners, or they are just more aggressive in their tillering, so they repair a little bit more quickly. This is a very common turf in St. George in the upper south because it's more heat tolerant than Kentucky bluegrass, but it's fairly cold hardy. So here's a picture. This is a newly seeded lawn with the turf type tall fescue, and this guy did a ½ acre of it. Again, I probably would have done less and put more landscape beds in, but what I wanted to show is that it actually makes a pretty lawn. It hasn't quite completely filled in yet. He's noticed that he needs to keep his mower blade sharper because the fibers in this particular grass are a little bit tougher, but overall it makes a nice turf. So here's a picture of an unsharpened mower blade on it and the kind of the look it takes on. Okay, special situations, chewings or creeping red fescue. This is a grass that's commonly used in shady areas because it's the most tolerant shade turf we have. I don't really like it at all unless you have so much shade that nothing else will grow under there besides a few weeds. So this is my neighbor's old house in Clearfield, and this lawn right here, it looks fine. This was taken about 10 years ago with a cell phone moving. So it's not the greatest quality, but what I will say about it is that it does make a lawn and not much more. I just don't like this unless you have a lot of shade. It just, when you mow it, even if you have a really sharp mower blade, it frays really easily, and it just has kind of an unkempt look. So here's a picture I took of a border of a different lawn to where you have fescue on your left and Kentucky bluegrass on the right. Both of them are freshly mowed, and you can kind of see the finish that the fescue takes on. This is chewings or red fescue, not the turf type tall. This is the chewings red fescue. It's thinner bladed, lighter green, but you can kind of see the difference here and why I prefer Kentucky bluegrass or the turf type tall fescue over the red. Mike, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to say that the chewings fescue or the red fescue is often used in seed blends. And so they might blend tall fescue and ryegrass and bluegrass and a chewings fescue in there. And the idea is that each one of those species will kind of dominate or do best in certain areas of the lawn. So where it's more shady, then the creeping fescue tends to be really dominant. And in my experience with it is, unless it's mowed pretty short, it really has a ragged look to it.
Yeah, it's not my favorite grass as far as if you're a turf connoisseur. So, okay. So some alternatives, buffalo grass, every once in a while get some buzz. I don't mind buffalo grass. It looks a lot like Kentucky bluegrass. It's expensive to get seed or sod if you can find sod. It has some special needs. Oh, that didn't come out right. The care is different than Kentucky bluegrass. How's that? Um, so on this one, it requires half the fertilizer of Kentucky bluegrass because it is only actively growing for half the time. So, but during the middle of summer, it'll stay green and tolerate being irrigated about every 10 days to 2 weeks, and it's perfectly happy. But it's only green from late May to mid-September. And the problem is when it's dormant, it doesn't tolerate a lot of foot traffic, and so it may not be an ideal grass if you have a lot of kids playing on it or do a lot of garden parties. So this is buffalo grass right here on a slope. The guy will go in and weed whack it a couple times, and then he lets it go to seed and go dormant. It's not a bad look, and it holds the hillside, and he just lets it survive on rainwater. And so far, it's done fine. Uh, this is another in the background over here where I'm moving my mouse back and forth. That is buffalo grass, and it looks a lot like Kentucky bluegrass, but it just goes dormant. But when it goes dormant, it goes really dormant. So this is a park or a golf course that has buffalo grass planted on it, and you can see people out there, but it just has a really brown look. It's kind of a straw brown, and some people don't like that as much. So others, crested wheatgrass is one that you occasionally see used on golf courses in areas that they can't get irrigation to. Logan City for a while and Cache County was voluntarily having their golf courses reduce their irrigation by 10% a year to conserve water. And the golf courses went into the roughs and took out their Kentucky bluegrass and put in this crested wheatgrass. They only needed to mow it about every 3 weeks to keep it green, but it is not suitable for a lawn if you're going to be playing baseball and things. It's more if you need something green and low water that you're going to maybe go out and walk on once in a while, maybe pitch a tent or something. But the use case scenario is very different than Kentucky bluegrass. The common turf type crested wheatgrass is called fairway. It stays shorter and it tolerates some mowing. Sometimes this is used in orchards and other areas. And with a little bit of irrigation through the summer, it will stay green. But it's just one of those that it's fine, but it's probably not something I would put in my front yard. Okay, alkali grass. This is one that is commonly used in areas with salt-affected soil. So if you've got areas like in Price or Magna or even out in Tooele areas, I think that this may become a little more common even here along the Wasatch Front, out towards areas like Eagle Mountain and toward the lakes where you have a lot of salt in the soil, because it makes a decent turf, but it only grows well and outcompetes other grasses if you have salt in the soil. If you tried to use alkali grass in normal soil, it would quickly be outcompeted by about anything else. And so you can sometimes order this from farm stores if you need it, but it'd be something that you did soil testing and your salinity was 5 or 6 or 7, the measure of it. And so you do this because you want lawn. They use this in Price quite a bit, and some areas of Colorado where they have the Manco shale-based soils. Okay, warm season grasses, so Bermuda grass and some others. So buffalo grass is actually a warm season grass, and that's why it grows really well in the middle of the summer and it goes dormant. During the summer, it photosynthesizes very efficiently, much more efficiently than, say, Kentucky bluegrass. But when temperatures are below about 90, it wants to go dormant because it can't compete against other grasses. So Bermuda grass is actually technically illegal to grow in Utah. USU has some test plots, and then it almost sounds like marijuana, to where in Washington County, Bermuda grass has been decriminalized. And so even though it's still technically against the law, you can plant it and they won't prosecute you. So the reason this is like when I was up in Weber County, in Davis County teaching a couple of weeks ago, on the west ends of those counties, Bermuda grass is a horrible problem and they can't get rid of it. And so the state hasn't wanted to get established elsewhere because it actually handily outcompetes almost any other grass, including Kentucky bluegrass. But where it's grown, it makes a great turf, and there's many kinds that will be about as soft as the newer ones are fairly soft, and some of the older ones can be a little bit stiff. But it's a good turf where it is grown. So this is just a salinity marker chart for different kinds of grass. Notice the alkali grass at the bottom here tolerates a lot of salt, to where Kentucky bluegrass doesn't. Middle road grass, if you've got some salt in your soil, let's say you live out in Saratoga or Eagle Mountain, that turf type tall fescue is one that I really like for soils that are moderately salty. Okay, so some things to be aware of. Bent grass. Bent grass is the putting green grass, the putting that you go to golf courses, and if they have natural putting greens, that's what they use. But it is not a grass meant for home use. Several years ago, when I worked at nursery up in Layton, part of my responsibilities was delivering to a lot of the landscapers, and they decided that they were going to turn their yards into selling points, a business part of their business. They could use them for a write-off, but they could also show their clients their abilities and different things they could do. And so one year, I know 5 or 6 of them installed um, PGA spec greens in their backyard. And I mean, that requires a lot of manipulation, certain kinds of sand. You can't just go to the garden center and buy sand. You have to have certain types. And they spent thousands of dollars installing these, and then they seeded the bent grass on there. And they even had to buy mowers that were $2,000 and $3,000 to mow this little 20 by 30 section of putting green. Lots of money. Within 1 year to 2 years, every landscaper had torn those putting greens out because the grass is very disease prone and it's very able to invade Kentucky bluegrass. And so they had patches of this really ugly grass all over their yard that has to be mowed short. And so this is one that if you want to do your own putting green, just use the artificial turf for it, because this is not something for a homeowner. Okay, annual ryegrass. This is what's used down in areas that have mild winters like St. George, Las Vegas, California, the South. They will overseed their Bermuda grass with this and keep their sports fields green during the winter. It's very inexpensive, but you need to know what you're doing, and we're too cold up here to actually do this. The very inexpensive like lawn patch kits that you buy from garden centers are very low end grass seed mixes, oftentimes have 25 or 30% annual ryegrass in them, and they kind of use it as a filler. And I always check the seed list to make sure this isn't there, because it will temporarily outcompete other grasses and then it dies. The other thing you don't want it to do is to go to seed, because it's actually quite hard to get rid of if you get it established. And so the people that know how to use it manipulate it so that they don't run into those kinds of problems. But here in northern Utah, we're too cold anyway, and it's just one I would avoid. Zoysia grass. This is another one that USU is actually actively researching, because it is a quite drought tolerant grass and it's quite soft, but it only is green for even less time than the Bermuda grass. So you might have lawn from the 1st of June to mid-September and then nothing. So this is one that I used to see advertised in newspapers quite a bit in the spring. This miracle grass, and a lot of these zoysia grass cultivars aren't really that cold hardy. So in a hard winter, they'll get taken out. There's a few that are, but you really need to be careful with it. And it's one that I would not use. So here's that advertisement I used to see in the paper, showing my age a bit, of the zoysia grass lawns, just how wonderful it is. And they wouldn't tell you that it was barely hardy in Salt Lake City. And this is another one that I saw around for a while called Canada Green, and they were selling it. It says carpets 1,000 square feet for just $16. Well, I mean, what they've done is taken a very low end grass seed, and because most grasses look good for a couple of years when they're newly seeded, people are like, oh, it's a miracle, I love this stuff. And they have charged $16 for something that maybe cost them $1 a pound. So it's another one that you really need to be careful of. I haven't seen this one for a while. 10 years ago, it was all the rage. A lot of the garden centers were carrying it. So grassology. So this was one I would see in Home Depot and Lowe's. This one seeds up to the package did 750 square feet. So it was about maybe 2 pounds. And the grasses in it were, again, just really low end crappy grasses. But you could easily, sometimes you would go into Home Depot and a 20-pound bag would be $50. And it was just another gimmick to sell really inexpensive seed for a lot of money. And it was another fly by night. So you really don't see this one, but you've got to be careful with them. So the grassology, if you look at the seed mix, creeping red fescue, hard fescue, tall fescue, perennial blue ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, sheep's fescue. I mean, besides the rye and the bluegrass, this is pasture mix. And it's just, and they charge, and they're, not only are you getting bad grass, but they're charging you a lot of money. Okay, and they even put on there, unless it's against the law, we don't have any liability, planted at your own risk. Okay, microclover. I've been seeing more and more buzz about microclover, and this is actually just the same clover that we planted in our lawns 50 years ago. It's a particular cultivar that only gets a couple of inches tall. What people are doing is planting it as a lawn replacement, assuming that it is more drought hardy than our grass. It's not. What will happen is that initially the clovers are a little bit more drought hardy when they're green. And so the clover, let's say your Kentucky bluegrass needs to be watered every 4 days, this might go 6 or 7. And then you need to water it again. But when you get hard, long drought on it. Kentucky bluegrass will survive on very little water for up to a year. All Kentucky bluegrass needs is 1 inch of water per month to stay dormant but keep the roots alive, and it'll do that for at least a year. This microclover under the same conditions will just die. So one of my former interns has planted this in a section of her yard, and she says it's fine. She mows it, and it does okay, but you need to be aware that we are in Utah and not Maine or Ohio, to where there's a lot more natural rainfall. And if you use microclover thinking that you're going to be saving a lot of water, the jury is still out, but you're probably not. Mike, have you seen anything different on this? Okay. So we've already talked a little bit about irrigation. The lawn needs to be kept wet when you first seed it. Then as you start to see that grass seed germinate, you can slowly back off. And what I've noticed just seeding my own lawns is that during cool weather, 55, 65, 70 degrees, especially if we have a lot of storms or it's cloudy, I can water once or twice a day. But if we're 85 or 90, I might water 5 times a day, maybe even 7 or 8 times a day for short periods to keep everything wet. And that's why I say if you're doing seed, to make sure that you try to do it in the spring and fall and not in the middle of the summer. Okay, so as things cool down, the point of this slide is just to say that you're trying to train your lawn to send roots deep. And so over the summer into the fall, you slowly draw back the amount of time you water, or the number of times you water, and you increase the amount of time, so that, when that grass is first coming up, you might still water once a day, but a month or two later, you go to twice a day, a month or two later, every other day. And after about a year or so, you should be able to get away with watering probably twice a week so that water penetrates into the soil 6 inches to a foot. But it will take about a full year for Kentucky bluegrass and other cool season grasses to get fully established. Okay, weeds in the lawn. If you do seed or hydroseed, it's just a fact of life. In the fall or spring, if it's cool enough, you can spray a lot of those weeds out using 2,4-D or just a lawn weed killer. But if you have grassy weeds in there, what you need to do is wait for the Kentucky bluegrass to establish to choke them out. Or if they're just in clumps here and there, there's nothing wrong with hand pulling some of that. Now, I'm often asked about, what if I have bindweed in my lawn? In my yard, can I do a lawn? And what I like to do is just control it the best I can the year before, knowing that it will come back. This lawn is not healthy, and that's why it's everywhere. But what I'll do, knowing I have bindweed, if I seed my lawn in early spring, the lawn will germinate before the bindweed comes up and help out compete it. And then because there's several sprays available that I can spray bindweed out of my lawn to at least suppress it, I don't worry about it as much, just because it's just a fact of life. It'll always be around, but I can do a pretty good job with good turf management and maybe an occasional spray to keep it at bay. Do you have anything to say, Mike, with this one? Okay.
No, I
All
think you
right.
covered it.
Okay. So this is true crabgrass. And if you have that germinating in a new lawn, you pretty much just have to get a screwdriver out and pop those out before they go to seed. And as the lawn gets more and more established, and as long as you do things right, things like that will be less common. You do not want to do a pre-emergent for crabgrass the first year you seed, because pre-emergents are root inhibitors. That's how they kill weeds, is they inhibit roots, and you will inhibit the roots on your grass that you just seeded until those roots get deep enough that you can put a pre-emergent over the top. Okay, let's see, it is 2 o'clock. We'll go about 15 minutes and take a break. Does that sound about right? Okay, so Mike and I get a lot of times questions, or someone will ask, what's just the absolute best fertilizer for my turf? You go to Home Depot or a garden center and you will see sometimes 15 to 20 options. And for people that don't know a lot about fertilizer, it can get very confusing very quickly. But in the end, most of those fertilizers are very similar to each other, and it's actually less important in most situations which one you choose. So they might have additives in there, 5% iron, or, really slow release this or that. And sometimes those can be important, but we'll talk a little bit more about those. So what's in fertilizer? You will see on a bag of fertilizer, and lawn fertilizers, this is usually displayed fairly prominently, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, N, P, and K. And what these numbers represent is the amount of each in that blend. So nitrogen, 16% of that is actual nitrogen. Then phosphorus, instead of being pure phosphorus, it's actually 16% P2O5 and then 8% K2O. And that's what the formula will tell you. So what these numbers, in just a really oversimplified way, but it helps you remember what they do: up growth, down growth, and all around. Or if you remember the saying up, down, all around, the nitrogen gives you a lot of green growth. The phosphorus is for root growth, and then the potassium is used in a lot of different areas of the plant for both rooting and photosynthesis. And so that's what the numbers are for, or what they do. But if we go back to our soil test and we notice that this particular soil test shows there's already high amounts of phosphorus and adequate potassium, in this situation, you could actually get away just fine using straight nitrogen. So 20.500 is very common at farm stores. It's usually tucked back in the corner at Walmart or Home Depot. It's the least expensive common homeowner fertilizer, and it's 80% of the time what I use on my lawn, because I've soil tested and I know I have adequate phosphorus and potassium in my soil. I sometimes will use other fertilizer. Let's say I check out Walmart in the fall and I found like $50 Scott's bags of fertilizer for $8. So I'll buy those and use them, but in general, I just use straight nitrogen. Sometimes people or lawn companies will use what's called urea, which isn't actually urine. It's chemically made, but it's really concentrated. And so because it stretches and a lot of times it's really water soluble, if you have a liquid fertilizer sprayed on your lawn by a professional company, a lot of times it's urea that they're applying. You can buy urea too from farm stores, but you need to be super careful with it, especially in the middle of the summer, because it's really hot. And if you over apply it, you can actually scorch your lawn. Some other options on these: sulfur-coated urea is a very common ingredient in slow release fertilizers. What
Hey,
happens is that,
Tom.
go ahead.
Question came in that I think is appropriate before you get too much farther in fertilizers. And the question is, what are adequate nitrogen levels? And I think there's two parts to this question to address. One is what's the nitrogen level in the soil already, and what's typically a nitrogen application for lawns, and maybe you'll cover that in a minute.
We will look at that in just a few minutes. I've got a fertilizer schedule that USU has put together, but you always assume that your lawn is nitrogen deficient unless you fertilize in the last 60 days. So when you do a soil test, the reason USU doesn't test for nitrogen unless you pay extra is it's just assumed, because nitrogen is so mobile in the soil that it becomes, you lack nitrogen very quickly. Plants can store it, but the soil doesn't. And so if you over fertilize, if you don't scorch your lawn, you're actually polluting, because those nitrates are oftentimes washed into the groundwater. So you assume that your soil is just automatically nitrogen deficient, and then we'll look at a fertilizer schedule in just a minute. So there's other forms of sulfur-coated or solar-release fertilizer. The advantages to these is that you can put them down and go a lot of times several weeks to a few months in between fertilizations. And as these slowly break down, they give slow doses of nitrogen to your lawn to keep it green, but you don't run into that situation to where the first couple of weeks after you fertilize, your lawn's more of a jungle that you're having to mow 2 or 3 times a week to keep up with it. Okay, fertilizer blends, 20-4-20, 24-5-10, 23-3-16. A lot of times our fertilizers have high nitrogen, low phosphorus, high potassium. But as we covered earlier, we oftentimes don't need these. And when you walk into Home Depot or Lowe's or your garden center or farm store, you'll see a lot of blends like this. But knowing that these are the percentages of each, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, 20-4-20, 24-5-10, 23-3-16, there's no difference in these. 6% to phosphorus or potassium here, there's really not a lot of difference. And that's when I say it's oftentimes less important which one you choose. And what you mainly need to look at is the amount of nitrogen in these as compared to other elements. Now, if you were short on phosphorus or potassium, it becomes more important to have those other elements in there, like the P2O or K2O5. But in those situations, like if you had a really sandy soil, Utah sandy soils are often short in phosphorus and potassium. What I actually recommend people do are use 1616 because you've got those in high amounts and you can find that particular blend at any farm store or garden center. But otherwise, if you have sufficient phosphorus and potassium, it's just really, I wouldn't get overly concerned about it because it's just something that shouldn't be a problem. So some organic options, corn gluten meal is a newer one. And what this is it's just a byproduct of processing corn that can be certified OMRI organic, if you like that. Corn gluten meal and other uses is sometimes used as a pre-emergent product, and it has to be put down absolutely correctly at the absolute right rates for it to work, but it can. But it also, for an organic fertilizer, is one of the fertilizers that's very high in nitrogen that isn't sourced from animals. So you'll pay triple for the amount of nitrogen. If you look at the unit of nitrogen in this as compared to a unit of nitrogen in like 2100, you pay 3 or 4 times for the organic source, but it is becoming more available. Milorganite is one that people that have been around garden centers know that it's sourced from human poo. They process it and sterilize it and put it in granules. It's used on golf courses quite a bit to melt snow off because it has a dark color on their putting greens to help prevent diseases, but you can buy it from a lot of farm stores. And then fish emulsion is another one that's commonly available that oftentimes actually smells like rotting fish when you put it down, but it can be certified organic. Milorganite cannot, but it is naturally derived. The fertilizer schedule. So I get a lot of blowback from lawn companies on how USU recommends fertilizing. And what this schedule right here assumes is that you're following the bag rate. And what that will do is every time you fertilize, if you measured out 1,000 square feet of your lawn, the bag rate, so the rate recommended on the bag, will put about 1 pound of actual nitrogen on that 1,000 square feet. So if you were using 20-00 fertilizer, what in that 20-00, because it's 20% nitrogen, you put 5 pounds of fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. So you don't really need to worry about that too much, but we're assuming on this particular schedule that you follow the bag rate. And so for lawns that only see traffic when they're mowed, the little to no use schedule is fine. You fertilize around Mother's Day and around Labor Day, and you're good. Because especially if you put your clippings and you mulch them back into your lawn, that equals 1 fertilization a year. That little to no use to where you're mulching your clippings back in after the spring, and then just fertilizing a couple times a year will keep your lawn perfectly green. That's actually the schedule I use on most of my areas where my kids play a lot. I fertilize a little more. The medium use, if you have a lot of kids playing, that's more of the schedule. Notice there's a November application there, and that's going to be late October into early November. And what that will do is get into the roots of the turf. The turf will store it. If you want your lawn to green up in the spring more quickly, that early November application is actually critical. You don't really want to be fertilizing if you can avoid it in mid-March. You're a lot better off doing that in November. The high use is actually for something you would do for a soccer field or a football field or a golf course where you're fertilizing that often. So with this being said, I've talked to a lot of lawn companies that still will apply 5 or 6 times a year, but I'm seeing it become more and more common that the lawn companies are actually reducing the amount of nitrogen per application. It's still coming that 5 or 6 times, and so what they're doing is keeping a low but consistent amount of nitrogen on your lawn to keep it green, but they're not over fertilizing, and they are keeping you from having to mow a lot with that style of application, which I'm actually fine with that because it helps them make the money they need to keep their business going, but they're not doing a lot of polluting or anything by over fertilizing.
Hey,
So
Tana,
go ahead.
a comment and then a couple of questions have come in. When they come in and do those fertilizer applications, especially if they're using a liquid application, they're really, really diluted. Otherwise, they would just kill the grass right out.
Yes.
So, and then a question from Cynthia: how do you soil test under your lawn? Our lawn adjacent to the sidewalk always struggles in the heat and gets quite weedy, unlike the rest of the lawn.
Well, I doubt that they need to soil test there unless they get a lot of salt from, say, if they live in a condo association and they put a lot of salt down there. If that area of the lawn is treated the same, then I would more suspect that there's irrigation problems, and that because the sidewalk heats up and the soil is warmer, you get more evaporation, and the weeds that are growing there are more drought hardy than your lawn, and that's why they're moving in.
Then a question from Evan. So what is all the step 1, step 2 advertisements about, like for lawn fertilizers?
I need to speak very carefully. I'm going to use my Jedi mind tricks here, try to be diplomatic, but the step programs are using the high use option. That's very similar. And if you have a heavily used lawn, those 4 and 5 and 6 step programs are great. But if you're more on the moderate one, then you don't need to do that. If you are treating your lawn well, you don't have a lot of weeds, there's no reason to put a pre-emergent down in mid-March. And so I use those on a case-by-case basis. And I have neighbors that absolutely need them because they have little kids playing on their lawn all the time. And I have other neighbors who are senior citizens that have a lawn company mow their lawn once a week, and that's the only time the lawn ever sees traffic. And so the little to no use program would actually be very appropriate. And so the 5-step programs are convenient. You don't have any guesswork. They give you a calendar saying on May 15th, do this, on July 15th, do this, and you just do it and walk away. And it's far less expensive usually than hiring a professional company. So, but once you kind of learn about lawns and their fertilizer needs, you will find that in many situations it's too much. And so what I'll do is go buy the lawn program every other year, and I just use half the fertilizer.
Yeah, the one other thing I think to clarify is that most of these products, like step 1 would usually have a pre-emergent in it. So again, if you're going to overseed your lawn or do anything like that, you don't want to use that. And then like a step 2 or step 3 will usually have some sort of like a weed and feed. It'll have some sort of weed killer in it as well, just as a preventative. In my experience, those granular weed control products are pretty much useless. So you need a liquid spray in order to really contact the leaves and have it actually control the plant.
And so if Mike and I were to start our own lawn company or our own garden center, the lawn program we would sell would be liquid pre-emergent or granular pre-emergent without fertilizer that you can do if you need it, liquid lawn weed killer if you need it, and for the average lawn, probably 2 to 3 bags of fertilizer.
Right.
And because
So,
we're selling it, you pay twice as much.
right. Now, just to follow up with that is question, using something like weed and feed, is that put down earlier than Mother's Day? How should I time it with watering?
Mike's
how would you?
addressed that a little bit already, but the weed and feed, if you're going to use a granular weed and feed, you actually put it down when your lawn is wet. So you actually need to run your sprinklers for a few minutes and then I like to use a handheld spreader and work my way backwards so I don't track through it. But you actually need a wet lawn so that those prills stick to the weeds and do any killing. But as Mike said, I would just prefer to use a liquid like a Weed Be Gone type product because they're far more effective.
And then Ralph asking if we're familiar with biograss. My neighbor put it in as turf and his lawn is beautiful, dark green and thick.
Biograss does actual scientific research for their sod mixes, and they pay attention to a lot of national and international research, continuing research groups, and they trial their turf in Utah. And they have test plots out in Vernon, Utah, and they sell a very good product. And what they're selling, they've actually researched, but you also pay for it. And so biograss, I'm never going to disparage because they've put so much research into their products. Now, if you were to go to, Joe's turf farm and buy Joe's turf as compared to biograss, give them 10 years, they would probably look somewhat similar. The biograss would still be darker green and probably do better. But let's say the non-name brand turf treated well will probably do fine too. It's just that biograss prides themselves on the amount of work and research they have put into their product.
So, and just a quick follow up on that, they also fertilize it a lot, and sod that you typically buy has been fertilized a lot. So it's going to be really thick and green, especially the year after it was installed, just because there's usually a lot of residual nutrient in there. But just that, like you said, Tom, any grass, if it goes for a while without being fertilized, isn't going to be dark green and thick anymore. So that has to be maintained. But they are using superior selections of cultivars and species in their grass mixes, and that can help as well.
Yeah, it can. And they're the only local company that I'm aware of that isn't just slinging stuff out and looking and saying, yep, it's drought tolerant. They actually have PhD level people and people with master's degrees doing the research to make sure that that's what's going on. So, okay, any other questions? Okay. All right. I wanted to talk a bit about Humate. And go ahead.
I'm sorry, I have a question. I can't find my little chat thing, but anyway, what if you did seed last year and it's coming up, but it's kind of slow? Should you fertilize it, or should
Well, when did you do seed last year?
really in the fall?
In the fall. And so, right now, did you fertilize it last year?
No, it was really, we just planted it and it grew, and it hasn't come up really great.
Okay, and it's still early. It won't really start to germinate until temperatures are consistently around 70 degrees. So I would give it a couple of weeks and maybe try putting down something like 1616. And the extra phosphorus and potassium, it would just do it that once. But sometimes that can help it root out a little bit more quickly, but it's still too cold.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So Humate, every spring I see advertised. Go ahead. Hopefully that was a mistake and that wasn't muted out. I didn't get the whole question. So on the Humates, I want to point out that they're fine to use. but they're not miracle products. You know, I saw an advertisement in one of the local farm stores the other day that had a really glossy, well put together ad for whatever brand of humate they were carrying. And what a humate is that you will get organic matter that's almost completely broken down, but it's not quite coal yet, and that's humate. And as you put water, let's say you put humates into water and they will start to break down a little bit or go into solution, what they will form are called humic and fulvic acids. And what this does is that there is some research out there saying that they will help open up soil, help with nutrient retention, and they will do that. But if you have a really unhealthy lawn and you put humate on it, it's not going to save your lawn. So I I don't like using humate as a fertilizer replacement. Humates are not that. Sometimes you will see a green up from humate because the company that manufactured it put extra nitrogen in there, like a 3 or 4% nitrogen. So you see a slight green up and you put it down, you're like, look, it greened up. Well, it's because they put extra nitrogen in there. So the humates can be useful if you have a situation to where you have a slightly compacted soil. They may help there a bit. They can maybe help break down thatch a little bit. But if you're going to use them, look at them more as of a tool among many tools that you use to maintain a healthy lawn, and don't just use them as the one thing you need for a healthy lawn, because they are not. So you can buy them and put them down and you're not hurting anything. But you know, if I have $20 to spend on a bag of fertilizer or a bag of humate, 9 out of 10 times, personally I'm going to buy a bag of fertilizer if I have to choose. So okay, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break right here, and we'll get back to it in just a few minutes.
Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I had a problem. My video camera went out, and I'm gonna just reboot my system, so I'll go offline during the break.
Okay, sounds good. Testing, testing, testing. Okay. Let's see. Hopefully folks are back and we'll get started again. So I'm going to get out of the screen share for just a minute to make sure my settings are still okay. Let's see. Things are looking fine. I'll reshare the screen and we'll get going. Let's see. Zoom share there and okay, can everybody see the screen okay? I'm assuming so. I can't really see the chat, so we will get going. So
Hey, Tom, can
go
you hear
ahead.
me?
Yep,
Did you start the recording again, or did you ever stop?
never stopped it.
Okay.
Let
All
me
right.
make sure.
I
Record.
lost some of the chats because I had to reboot, so I don't know. I think we're good.
Yeah, it's still recording.
Okay.
So thank goodness for editors after the fact. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get going. So fertilizer application tools. So how am I going to get the fertilizer down on my lawn? My favorite way to put fertilizer down is to have the fertilizer be a granule and then I just use a broadcast spreader. If you miss an area, it's a lot less likely to show up, but with that, it's a lot less accurate. And so we'll cover some ways to overcome that. The drop spreaders, and I thought I had pictures in here of all this. Maybe I don't. No, okay. So the drop spreader is the one that you would just push forward that drops the fertilizer straight down. Those are useful for park strips and things, but if you miss, it's very, very obvious. So what I like to do on the broadcast spreader is if I have actual rates that will work, a lot of times if you buy Scott's fertilizers, they have very rates that only are for Scott spreaders. And if you have an Earthway or a different brand, sometimes they don't match up. And so what I'll do is put my spreader on a fairly low setting, knowing that I'm under applying. And if I know the bag of fertilizer I bought does 10,000 square feet, my lawn is say 10,000 square feet too, and I should use the entire bag, I will have some left over after the fact, and then I'll just reapply it at a low setting and just sometimes I double apply. Some other things I do is because I am applying at a lower rate, I will go one direction and then I'll go perpendicular to it. So one time I'm going north and south, the next time I'm going east and west. So and I'll do half applications that way to make sure at least every area got some. Okay, next. So this is an example right here. I was called out to a home and there were spots everywhere. And at first I thought dog spots, but the homeowner was like, nah, I don't own any dogs, and none of the neighbors have any, and there were these dead spots everywhere. And this is that same picture from the fescue on the left and the Kentucky bluegrass on the right. But I was trying to figure out what was going on, and as I started looking, like, what is this? I mean, that would have had to have been one massive dog for that sort of a spot. And what had happened is I finally put two and two together on these. And this is where these spots are, is everywhere that the guy sat his bag of fertilizer down, that had a hole in the bottom of it, and that's where he dragged it across his lawn. So when you're doing your fertilizer, just in case, put it on cement or pavement so that you can sweep it up. And this fertilizer burn, this is what that looks like, is because of all the excess salts that landed in that area. Okay, and some other options. This is a situation up in Logan to where um, there was a church up there that the pastor was out of town for a couple of weeks, and the pastor loved the turf at their church. That was his pride and joy. He personally fertilized it sometimes, really had a love of that grass. And so he went home for a couple of weeks. And when he was coming back about a day before, somebody on the landscape committee noticed that the grass had started to brown out, which this is absolutely fine. This is just drought stress. And with a little bit of irrigation, after 3 or 4 weeks, it would come right back. But they were freaking out because the pastor loved this lawn so much. And so we went in, and within about 1 hour, we fixed it. And so this is before and after. And what I did here was we got turf paint. It's a green water-based latex paint that's safe for most plants and grass. And we spray painted the turf, and the landscape committee was able to fix the irrigation system. The clock had tripped due to some lightning, and the batteries in it, the backup batteries, were dead. And so it's still a little light green, but the pastor never knew the difference. And we got the lawn greened up, and I'm probably going to hell for deceiving a pastor, but it worked. Okay, this is another example of turf paint right here. I oftentimes have summer meetings, and my wife is not an outdoor person. This was taken several years ago. I got home, and kind of horticulturist, you're kind of held to a higher standard. And so this is turf paint on my front lawn, and you can see on the right where I sprayed and on the left where I haven't yet. But if you have a wedding or something, this can help. Some things to be aware of with turf paint, if you want to go to that extreme, is that when you apply it, always apply it from a pump sprayer. And you want to find mist, almost like you're spray painting. You don't want to apply it out of a hose and sprayer because the droplets are too big. Some other things is that you don't ever wear clothes that you want to ever use again, because it's paint and it will stain, and I have never seen a sprayer that doesn't leak a little bit. And so you also want to try to keep it off the cement. It'll eventually sun fade, but it'll take several months. But if you're doing a wedding or something like that, sometimes these can be a help. If you ever watch the Masters tournament in the spring, the Augusta National, and any other golf course that is higher end uses turf paint all the time, and that's why you never see brown spots on them. So and you want to make sure that you have a good sprayer that leaks as little as possible, because you'll get this green stuff dripping down your pants and on your shoes, and it can stain your skin temporarily, and so you can look a little silly with that. So just be aware. Okay, some other things. This is in downtown Provo. The particular entity is very afraid of getting sued, and so every spring when the snow melts off and the grass greens up, there's 6-inch to foot wide strips along the sidewalk where they put down way too much salt, and the grass doesn't recover until the salt leaches through the soil. And they're very fortunate that they actually have well-drained soil, because a compacted clay would hold those salts, and they would probably have to dig it out to fix it. But this happens every year. So you've got to try to avoid things like this too. This is something right here. I looked at this. This is January in Las Vegas. And I was like, that's kind of a naturally green. And I looked out there a little more closely, and this is artificial turf. You've probably seen that artificial turf, the technology that goes into it, is actually pretty incredible. And you can get situations where it's hard to tell that it's actually fake. This is actually at one of the casinos, and it's a smoking area that has some patio tables because the casino is no smoking. Okay, so those are just some alternatives that you might look at if you have small areas or something, or need to reinvigorate your turf. So irrigation. So I've already been getting lots of questions about when do I turn my irrigation on and when do I start watering. And I've wanted to install little electric shockers on people's hose bibs that every time they grab the hose bib, that it shocks them until it's actually time to irrigate. And that's generally along the Wasatch Front sometime in late April to mid-May, depending on our weather. Or, if you did have a little shocker on your hose bib and you wanted to have some fun with your husband, that could be a nice evening of entertainment too, watching him try to water. Anyway, I'll get on with this. So the water, the amount you put down slowly tapers up and then back down according to the temperatures. So from May to mid-June, when we're in their 70s and 80s, your lawn needs about a half inch to an inch and a half of water every 7 to 10 days. And you're sitting there saying, well, how long do I run my sprinklers? The only way you're going to know is if you test. You can put out soup cans, tuna cans. I have in my office here, when we open back up, some special cups that will help you measure. But you run your sprinklers for 10 minutes. Let's say you put out some soup cans. You put several of them in a line along the particular zone, and you run for 10 minutes, and then you just measure the amount of water in each one, average them, and times it by 6 to get what you would put down per hour is the easiest way to do this. You can run for 15 minutes or whatever you want to do, but until you actually measure how much your irrigation system is putting out, you don't know. Another way to gauge is if you want the water to penetrate into your soil 6 inches to a foot deep when you irrigate. And so that generally takes about a half inch of water to penetrate about 6 inches into the soil. Okay, so slopes and sandy soil, especially if you have clay, you may have to utilize, if you have grass on them, the programs on your sprinkler clock. If you look at a sprinkler clock, it oftentimes, and Mike, I'm delving into areas you're better at, but your sprinkler clock has an A, a B, and a C, and sometimes a D setting. And a lot of times we just use the A setting, and what that is it's a program. And so we use the A program, but what you can do is set up your sprinkler clock to use a B program and even a C program. And where the sprinklers are on the slope, you might only run them for 5 to 10 minutes and then let them sit for 2 hours, then let them run for 5 to 10 minutes, let them sit for 2 hours, and then run again for 5 to 10 minutes. And what will happen is you put enough water down that it soaks into the soil, but it doesn't wash away. And you give that weight to it and then water for a short period of time again. And that's one trick you can use if you have a decent sprinkler clock to manage slopes and keep them green during the summer. If you have loamy soil, you don't really know for sure until you soil test. Everyone assumes they have clay, but until you soil test or do something that you can do on your own, the jar test or something, loamy soils are actually ideal because they hold enough water, but they have good aeration in them. And in a clay, even though we know that clays hold on to water really well, because they're so dense and there's so little airspace in them, clays, because they hold on to that water, you actually don't need to put as much water on them because the water doesn't penetrate very deeply, and oftentimes plants growing in there are more shallowly rooted. And so what you actually try to do, especially on heavy clays, is develop topsoil in the top 4 to 6 inches that gives them enough room to grow. And then under that, you just kind of do your best.
Hey, Ton, real
Yep.
quick. There's a question from Lynette to kind of go over how to measure water with the soup cans.
Okay.
More detail.
So the first, you've got to eat a lot of Campbell's chicken noodle soup. And then you save your cans, and you don't want to try to eat it all in one sitting. I'm just kidding. So just save some your corn, vegetable cans, soup, whatever it is. And
so the bottom line is here that it doesn't matter what can you use as long as it's not a tuna fish can. You need something with a taller side.
And so what would you say, 6 or 8 of them per zone? You would
Yeah,
set them
the more the
out.
better, but yeah, at least 6 or 8. You also have at the office there, I think you mentioned last week, there's some cups that people can borrow that are designed exactly for this.
Yeah, and there's a formula you can plug in the amount of water in the cup that'll tell you how much you're watering. But soup cans are fine too if you have them. And so you would line them along in your zone every 5 or 6 feet, or if your zone's 40 feet long, just put them periodically at even distances on the zone. How far out from the sprinkler heads would you go, Mike?
So usually the closest one, you probably put about 3 feet from the sprinkler head and then somewhere out towards the middle of the zone.
Okay.
I was gonna pull up a picture of one just
Okay.
real quick. So
Let me
find one.
unshare so you can share. Okay.
Well, I haven't found it yet.
Oh,
So go ahead.
okay. I'll reshare I kicked myself out of the presentation. So slideshow from current slide. There we go. And it looks like I'm still sharing. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So on those soup cans, what you would do is you would run the sprinklers for an amount of time that's easy to do math with. So 6 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Let's say you ran for 15 minutes. And what you would do is go collect those soup cans and measure with just a little ruler or something the depth of water in the can. And you do this in inches. You probably are only going to have maybe 1/3 of an inch or a 1/2 inch or something. And so
Well,
what
I
you would
found a
do,
picture too.
okay,
You could
so
pull it up.
let me unshare temporarily. Stop share. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, you've disabled screen sharing on your end, so I can't.
Let me see. Oh, it won't let me more. Allow. Huh, yeah, on the sidebar, it won't let me allow screen sharing for you.
Okay.
So I will reshare on my end. And let's see this one. Share. Okay. So we'll take care of that after. I apologize for the delay there. But what you would do is average the depth of water in all the cans. Let's say you had 6 cans or 8 cans. So you would get an average of all those. And then if you ran for 15 minutes, your final number you multiply by 4 to get a full hour. And so let's say you had 1/3 of an inch, you times that by 4, and you're putting about, about an inch an hour, or an inch and 1/3 an hour down. So you can just use math and multiply it out. Now, if I've made that as clear as mud, we do have fact sheets on how to do this. And if you wanted to come by my office after we're open again and collect those cups, it's actually pretty easy. So, okay. So I wanted to show this picture right here. This was when I was at some work meetings in Kansas City, Missouri. And this lawn right here was just freshly mowed. I watched them mow it. If you look at it by a lot of our standards, it looks like it needs mowed. And I'd normally ask here, why is it so long? And just the short answer is that if you leave it longer, it requires less irrigation and it's more drought hardy and the roots go deeper. So also this is turf type tall fescue right here. And so it's actually quite a pretty turf grass. Okay, and I wanted to show this. Deeper roots just mean healthier, more drought tolerant grass. I like this picture right here because it shows mowing height is related to rooting depth. And I've already told the story about my dad and cutting really short and his problems with spurge and crabgrass, but this is just a picture that shows visually what happens. The bottom left, I just wanted to show that this isn't a wise use of turf. It's overwatered. And since they can only mow in one pattern, they've worn grooves in the grass. So this is Bermuda grass right here, and this is in a tropical environment. And they've mowed this turf so consistently that I thought this would be really almost impossible, but they've worn grooves through Bermuda grass because they never vary their mowing pattern. Okay, mulching mowers. So in the spring, a mulching mower chops up grass clippings so fine that they just work their way back down into the soil and quickly decompose. In most situations, they do not add to thatch at all. So the way to tell if they're adding to your thatch layers, if when you mow with a mulching blade or a mulching mower, if you leave a trail of grass behind you, the grass is too tall and too thick, and you'll probably want to bag it. But otherwise, if you're not leaving anything behind you, those grass blades are being chopped up fine enough to work their way back into your soil. The advantage to doing this, besides being able to mow a lot more quickly, is that it reduces the number of fertilizations per year by 1. So if you mulch after that that 2 or 3 week period in spring, if you mulch those clippings back in the rest of the year on that fertilization schedule, the reason you can skip one on the lightly used is because you put the equivalent of one fertilization into your lawn if you use a mulching mower. Okay, thatch develops because you're growing grass on really heavy clay soil or compacted soil, and oftentimes combined with that, it's overwatered. And so thatch forms, it's really common in Kentucky bluegrass. Other grasses don't get it as much. But what thatch is actually dead roots and crowns, and there's not actually a lot of blades in it. And what will happen is the roots of the grass can't penetrate into the soil very deeply. And so over time, the roots just grow in the old, dead, somewhat decomposed roots, and it forms this kind of thatchy layer that over a number of years can get to the point that it actually becomes really spongy. So ways around this are to manage your irrigation well so that you're letting the soil dry out a little bit between irrigations, and then aerating with a hollow tine aerator that pulls plugs out. And so as that punches down in there, they don't go very deep, but it pulls thatch and a little bit of soil. And as that decomposes, the soil has microorganisms that are reintroduced into the thatch layer that will break it down more quickly. And even as you pull like an inch or an inch and a half plug out of that compacted soil, it opens up the soil to where those roots can penetrate a little bit more deeply. So it can take a few years to get your thatch layer to a healthy level, which is around 1/2 of an inch. So in Kentucky bluegrass, if your thatch is more than an inch, I would consider aerating at least annually. If it's like an inch and a half, I would probably aerate in the spring and fall and manage my irrigation really well. And if you need help, that's something that Mike and I or Meredith can help with, and it may require some soil testing because sometimes sodium can help close off a soil, and if it's not, and it can create drainage problems and things. And so that's how you'd manage a thatch layer. I should put here, if I didn't put it in, let's see. I wanted to talk about, I've seen a lot of lawn services over the last couple of years offering what they're calling liquid aeration. And what it is they're using surfactants and um, wetting agents to flush the water through the soil more quickly. And they chemically make it so that the water in most soils will penetrate faster, and it temporarily, and I don't even like this term, opens up the soil. And what's happening is you're basically diluting dish detergent at a really a certain rate, and it will increase water penetration for a month to 6 weeks, but they eventually break down. And I've talked to a couple of soil scientists, consulted with Mike and JD, and we just kind of come to the consensus that, and mainly the soil scientists on campus, that the hollow tine aeration is superior to any chemicals that you can put on your lawn that will temporarily open it up. Because you're pulling those plugs out, introducing microorganisms, and physically aerating the soil, it's just going to do a better job. Now, the one situation to where soil scientists felt like that the liquid aeration might help is if you have a lot of salt in your soil, and they might help flush the salt through, especially sodium salts. And so some of these products will include gypsum, a liquid gypsum with them, and that gypsum binds the sodium temporarily. And so if you have really salty soils like out in Eagle Mountain or Saratoga, I wouldn't use these products to actually aerate, but I might use them in the fall or early spring. We're still getting a lot of rain and snow to see if I can flush some of those salts deeper into my soil. Mike, did you have anything to add on the liquid aeration? Okay.
No, that's kind of new, and we're still kind of figure that one out.
But the tentative message here from campus is that the hollow tine aeration is going to be superior, even though it's a little more difficult. So on lawns, sometimes no amount of aeration will eliminate the thatch layer. And you could maybe get if you've ever dragged a thatch rake where you're dragging thatch out of your lawn, especially if you're out of shape, if you want to have a heart attack quickly, just do that for like 10 minutes. But you can buy special mowers or special mower blades that will dethatch your lawn, and it rips it up. It really damages the lawn. But if you're to the point that you're ready to rip your lawn out, I would actually recommend using one of these dethatching blades and then aerating after the fact and just raking it all off before replanting. It'll take the lawn a month or two to recover, but that's going to be the last ditch effort before you start over. Sometimes you can get verticutters and things like that that are just different styles, but the only time I recommend these dethatching blades is if you're ready to rip your lawn out because there's just way too much thatch on it. So they're just really, really damaging. Okay, how do you know if you need to aerate? Up until recently, and they still do, the Boy Scouts will do spring fundraisers and things with aerating, and I was just like, fine, I'll give you the $40, and if I don't need it, just to help the cause. But the way to know if you need to aerate regularly is if you have clay soil, or if your soil is heavy trafficked. So people are walking on it, playing sports a lot, and you've got a loam or a clay. I would consider aerating every spring, and especially if it's clay, every spring and fall. Oh, there's the liquid aeration right there. So I just put it in a little later. Okay, mowing leaves into the lawn. I and the next picture will show a little bit, like the top left is fine. If you have that few leaves and you don't have a heavy thatch layer, I just run my mower over that and not think about it. But if they're as thick as the bottom right or thicker, I still might mow them, and after I mow them, to tear them up a bit and get the size smaller, I'll bag them and then put them into my garden or a compost pile, because you can actually, if you've had problems with snow mold on your lawn, that the leaves that thick mowed in can sometimes cause problems. So the top one is, yeah, go ahead and mow them in. The bottom one is collect them. So, all right, irrigated pest management. Let's talk about some different things here. So what I want to mention here is, because we're going to talk about a few chemicals and things, is that a healthy, well-managed lawn that isn't over-fertilized rarely has problems with diseases and pests. Oftentimes the lawns that have the worst problems, and it's not every time, but oftentimes the lawns with the worst problems are usually mowed short and way over fertilized. If your neighbors have things going on, sometimes you can get problems from there, but in general, if your lawn is well maintained, it's much more resistant to a lot of these things. So you know, a lot of times people, when they bring in turf samples into my office, will bring in samples of brown grass, and that oftentimes actually doesn't do me any good. What I need for a sample, and the best way to tell what's going on, is that interface between the green and the brown. And so if I were to collect a sample to send to campus or bring into the office, I would get something right on the border with green and brown in it, because that whatever's going on, that's the interface, and that's where we can see all the evidence and it's not too dead. So what I do when I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with a lawn is the first thing I do is just get a screwdriver out and I try to push it into the soil in different areas. And right here, that you can tell the soil is really dry, and this is just drought soil. But when I talked to this person, they thought they had a fungal disease. And so what I'll do, especially if they've recently irrigated, is try to push a screwdriver in and see how far it penetrates. This one right here is bone dry, but you can tell how far the water penetrated because the screwdriver will go in really easily. And when the soil gets dry again, you'll feel a lot more resistance. And so a day after you've irrigated, you should be able to push that screwdriver in about 6 inches to a foot. So this is my first indication. If the soil is really dry, is brown, probably because of just irrigation problems. Now let's say oh, here's a picture of a drought affected lawn. A lot of times people don't know what to look for, but this in general, this was taken in early summer. I don't think these people have turned on their irrigation system yet. And this is just general drought stress. And the lawn is turning brown because it's running out of water. This isn't disease, is the main point. So if the screwdriver penetrates all the way in, I know that they're getting enough water, and the next thing I'll do is try to pull up the grass. If that grass, if you yank both feet and just pull for all you're worth, the grass is going to come up. But I just gently but firmly pull, and if that grass comes up and there's very few crowns or roots on it, it's probably an insect problem, even if you don't see the insects. So sometimes this grass will come up like a carpet, and it's just very easy to lift back, and that's because something's been chewing on it, and it has made it so that the top of the grass is dead because there's nothing there supporting it as far as getting it water or nutrients. Now let's say that the grass doesn't really, oh, so here's the situation right here. I missed my picture. Situation right here to where the grass pulled out fairly easily, and we did a little bit more investigation. And I think I found carcasses of things in here, but I suspect that was insect. So in situations where the grass won't pull out, but it's just going brown, that's usually an indication of fungal disease or something in the soil. And that's the point where I will start to bring others in that have better testing equipment. And I might send a sample off to campus to have them look at the sample with their very expensive equipment to see if they can find anything. This right here, I thought was maybe a fungal disease. This is just more for trivia. It turned out to be clover mites, and they're very uncommon, but the clover mites were sucking all the juice out of the grasses and slowly progressing, and these will eventually just decimate turf. And so the guy took care of it that had this problem. This whole area right now, instead of being grass, is cement, and that's how he took care of it. Okay, so a lot of times you may assume that something really bad has happened. You know, people, this is up in Logan on Old Main. Somebody mistakenly sprayed herbicide all over the place, and you might assume that could be a disease, but that's herbicide damage. And so you really need to know what you're looking for in these sorts of situations. There's just another picture from farther away. So insect management. So I kind of, doing that pull the grass test to see if there's insect damage, but you need to watch if you start getting brown patches in your lawn. The first thing we assume is that it is water. There's not enough water getting there, and so we increase the amount of irrigation, and that oftentimes makes the turf more unhealthy. And so by the time we realize that maybe isn't irrigation problems, we have brown spots spreading everywhere, and it becomes a lot harder to deal with the situation. And so if it's insects, as I mentioned earlier, the turf is easily removed, and oftentimes the different insects have life cycles, and so at a point they'll go dormant and the turf partially recovers a little bit, but you really need to know what insect is causing the damage to really effectively treat. So this right here is a football field or a soccer field in Spanish Fork that the person managing the park thought was irrigation problems. We went in there and very quickly determined that it was Kentucky bluegrass billbug, and it took about 6 months for the grass to completely recover from this. We'll get into how to treat that in a minute. So white grubs, if you've ever seen tin-lined June bug, go forward for a second. Right here, these are white grub larvae, but the June bugs you see in the summer that make that low buzzing noise that are on your porch around the light at night, they sometimes stick in your hair. Those are one of the main culprits of white grubs in your lawn. They're by far the most damaging, but they're not as common. There's a few other species we occasionally see. Japanese beetle we don't have here yet. There's the June beetles, mass chafers, and black turf attanius are some that we will find locally. So on your right is tin-line June beetle. This other on the left is actually another June beetle that was more common up in Logan. When I lived up there, we actually rarely saw the tin-line June beetle, but we'd get this red one. They have a 2 to 3 year life cycle, so those grubs can easily be in the soil for a couple of years. Mass chafer here has a 1 year life cycle, feeds on bluegrass and fescue. Black turf and Tanius is the smallest of these. They're not as common. You see them once in a while, but they can be very damaging. I actually saw a lot more of these up in Davis County than I do down here. Too far. There we go. Bill bugs. Now these are a different family of beetles. These are snout-nosed beetles. We have 3 or 4 species of these here. The Denver and Kentucky bluegrass bill bugs are the most common. They're actually native, and they fed on native grasses before we put lawns every year but they can have 1 or 2 generations per year. They feed on the crowns and roots, and the lifestyle and the life cycle varies by species on these. So as we've talked about earlier, optimize your turf health. Sometimes you can find resistant grass varieties. If you have really bad problems, you can start to top dress. A lot of times, though, you do need to do a preventative if you've had a lot of problems. There's several available. Imidacloprid is the most common, or this merit that you would put down sometime in late to April to mid-May, depending on the weather. And some of these, especially like imidacloprid, break down in our alkaline soils. So even though the bag says season long, there's a lot of situations that you want to do another application in July to keep them under control, because the alkaline soil does break that active ingredient down. Now, there's some more common commercial products. Meridian is one. Acelloprin is another. Now, this acelloprin is actually the active ingredient in Scott's Grub-X. And the reason I bring up Scott's Grub-X, this acelloprin is not organic, but it's very reduced risk, and it doesn't break down in alkaline soil. It has to go down now, but it should, if it's put down correctly at the correct rates, it should last the entire season. You'll pay a little bit more up front, but if you're wanting something that is going to do a good job and be the least harmful to pets and to little kids, potentially harmful, this acelloprin is the safest of all of these products. Okay, on the bluegrass bill bugs, we oftentimes see damage show up in July. And unless you catch it really soon, like the 1st of July, late July and August, it's oftentimes too late, but people will still want to try a last-ditch effort. These products will say something like 24-hour grub control or something like that, but 7 and Dialox are the common ingredients in these. You can put them down, but a lot of times, if you're not totally wasting your money, you've missed that opportunity in April and early May. And so these are oftentimes, sometimes I wouldn't even do them because it's just the damage is done, and it's just something that's kind of reactionary that makes you feel good that may or may not do any good. Um, I should say also with these grubs that you will put something, let's say you did Dialox in early July and you still have damage showing up. The reason that damage is showing up is you probably killed whatever was there, but it takes the grass sometimes a couple of weeks to totally die. And so there's a lag effect on when the grass actually stops showing damage. Okay, sod webworm is another fairly common pest. You have this if you start seeing brown spots in your lawn, and when you walk on your lawn, especially in the evening, little white moths start flying up at your feet, or when you mow. Now, if you walk to your lawn and every 10 or 15 steps, one of these flies up, I wouldn't do anything. It's such a low level, I wouldn't worry. But if you see one fly up every time you take a step, I would treat. They're easy to get rid of. There's lots of different things registered for them, but if you don't treat within a couple of months, they can decimate a lawn. Okay, this is an example of sod webworm damage. The sod webworms are a little more likely to be seen in the spring. They're seen before other pests, but the lawn in here is totally damaged and dead. And so they had to go in and remove everywhere that things were totally dead and put sod down because this particular yard was going to have a wedding in it. And they were actually farmers and they didn't have time to do anything. And finally, when it got so bad that the wife was like, you need to do something or else, sod was the answer, to where a month before a $20 bag of insect killer would have taken care of it. Okay, so if you want to try something more organic, sometimes you can find BT products or spinosad products that are registered for them. Places like Gardens Alive will sell parasitic nematodes, but those you have to be careful with. They're a little bit finicky. Sometimes they don't overwinter. Otherwise, there's many products available. I think saw Ryan Davis, who taught down here a month or two ago, said that he thinks that there's over 300 registered products for sod webworm available. Okay, this is more common up in Cache Valley and Box Elder County. This is called cranberry girdler or subterranean sod webworm. They feed more deeply and they are common in the fall, in August and September and in early October. And even though they are a sod webworm, they're a different species and they're very damaging to turf. And so up in the Logan area, a lot of the lawn contractors that do lawn maintenance actually advertise late summer treatments for these, and it's the only place in Utah that they have to do that. I think these may have made it into North Ogden, but they're not down here yet. So you would just treat for them in late July and August. And sometimes if you find them, it's almost too late. And so it's the next year, you're like, okay, it's late July and August, let's get a treatment down so that you don't have that damage reoccur. Okay, some common diseases before we wrap up. This is called fairy ring, and it's caused by a fungus that is breaking down organic matter in the soil. A lot of times these are a little more common in areas where you have a heavy thatch layer, and they're not necessarily super damaging. They're just, some people consider them unsightly. And what's happening is the fungus breaks down the organic matter, small amounts of nitrogen are released, and the grass grows more quickly in that ring where the fungus is or has been. So a way to mask these is actually fertilizer. If you notice in this particular picture, there's lots of clover, and that's another sign that the lawn is nitrogen starved. And so correct fertilization will mask this, and they oftentimes just go away. or else they move into neighbors' yards. If you want to, you can take your hose out, put a high pressure nozzle on it, and shoot it down into that ring about every 6 inches, staggered around. And that extra aeration sometimes helps. But these fertilization will help mask that enough. After a year or two, they usually go away. Okay, necrotic ring spot. This one is far more damaging. Summer patch would fit into this too. And we are seeing more and more problems with these. Mike, do you have any suspicions why we're seeing a lot more now than we did 15 years ago?
No, my main thought on it is just that there's just a lot more inoculum, so there's just a lot more disease pressure on them, and couple that with typically with higher temperatures that we've been seeing, it tends to be a little more prevalent. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I
Also,
agree. I've seen also the overhead irrigation has become a lot more common, and so our lawns are wetter on the surface where we're used to use flood irrigation. That may contribute to it too.
yeah. There was a question about watering or rain watering in an insecticide, and is a granular or a liquid preferable for bill bugs?
I personally prefer the granules, and it's just a preference thing. There's no like scientific evidence. Just because I can put a granule down, and if you read the label, it'll actually say to run your irrigation system for 5 to 10 minutes or to water it in for 5 to 10 minutes. And what that does is drives the granule through the thatch layer and gets it down into the soil where the insects are actually feeding. And so you don't want to run it too long because you can actually leach the active ingredient out, but you oftentimes run your irrigation for 5 or 10 minutes. Or if you do a liquid while the lawn is still wet, I will run the irrigation for 5 or 10 minutes to do the same thing. The reason I don't
Yeah,
like the liquids is they stick to the grass and it's harder to get them through.
yeah, and I would say that even if you use a liquid, you should irrigate for a few minutes to wash it off the grass and down into the upper soil layer.
So any other questions?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, so these pictures right here, the one on the left shows necrotic ring spot in all of its glory. And during the summer, you sometimes see partial recovery. And so the lawn on the right, if I were able to expand that picture more, you would still see faint rings. But during the middle of the summer, it sometimes slows down. Now, the main way I know this is necrotic ring spot is that necrotic ring spot's a little more common in the spring and fall, although it can be in the middle of the summer. But summer patch, which looks almost exactly the same, is a little more common during hot weather. So the picture on the right, without sending it to a lab, I would suspect, because I took that picture in July, that that's necrotic ring spot and not summer patch. But the treatment for both are almost exactly the same. So because these diseases are so hard to get rid of, there isn't a chemical that you can just spread on your lawn and get rid of it. It's the ideal time to do that. Make sure it's not on the next one. So it's the ideal time to use a fungicide for both summer patch and necrotic ring spot is in the spring when temperatures are consistently around 70 degrees. The reason for this is that that is the time where the fungi are the most susceptible to being killed. So later on in the summer and in the fall, you can suppress it, but that's just your best timing. Otherwise, keeping your fertilization up, I'm not saying over fertilizing, but when we talked about doing half applications, in this situation, slow release fertilizers with all three, like the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in them, we've seen that they can help the lawn recover more quickly and be a little bit more resistant to damage. Eventually, if you've fixed your irrigation and you fertilized, you've done your fungicides, and you're just not seeing good results, you actually may have to go in and aerate the areas that have the disease in it. And what you would is pull the aerator off and wash it off when you're done so you don't spread it. But you aerate those areas in the spring and fall, and spread a resistant grass. So the turf type Paul fescue and the ryegrasses are ones that you could try. Some of the local farm stores will actually sell bags of grass seed that just say necrotic ring spot resistant grass. You can try those, but a couple of years of top dressing with other species of grass over the Kentucky bluegrass can help diminish this and eventually get rid of it too. There's just not a once and done treatment. There's a couple of companies out. There's one called Ring to Green that, as long as you're using their treatments, they can almost get rid of it and mask it really well. But as soon as you stop, oftentimes the disease comes back. So there's just really not a good solution. I think even though it's the longest term and the initially the least satisfying, that top dressing with resistant seed is the best way to do that. Mike, do you have any other input on that?
Sorry, I had to click the mute button. No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, these are just kind of tough to control, and there is increasing better genetics in some of the grass species to help deal with this.
Yeah, and so it's just they're one that when you get it, it could be 2 or 3 years before you get rid of it. All right, snow mold. Snow mold is very common when we get early snowfall in late October or November before the ground has frozen. All grasses are susceptible to it, and there's actually several species of fungi that thrive at temperatures right above freezing. So you've got this insulating blanket of snow at 32 degrees on the top of the grass, and the soil is maybe 35 to 40 degrees, and they're just conditions that are really ideal for all of these different fungi to thrive in the winter. They look fairly similar, even though they're different species. When the snow melts off, the picture in the top right shows what they look like, and then the residual damage is on the bottom. And sometimes you can get huge swaths of lawn that are damaged. Now, there's people will want to put a fungicide down in the fall to try to prevent this. It's kind of useless. There are not any fungicides available to homeowners that have enough residual to prevent it. And if you could buy them, they would be very, very expensive. So some strategies to diminish the chances you get this and diminish the damage is actually the final mowing you do in the fall. A lot of times people don't know why, but you cut your grass down to about 1.5 inches or maybe even an inch, so that during the winter it's less likely to lay over, because these fungi thrive in low oxygen environments. And if your grass mats over, then that can help create low oxygen, and they do really well. Get the leaves off of those areas also. Make sure that you don't have any leaves left on the lawn. Now, in shaded areas, these are far more common than in sunny areas, even though you can get them in the sun. And in the shaded areas, if there's just nothing you can do to get rid of it, I actually would consider taking the turf out and just putting some shrub beds or flower beds in those areas so you don't have to deal with it. But in general, in the spring, when you see this, you rake the grass and fluff it up, and the grass recovers within about 4 or 6 weeks, and you'll never know you had it. Every once in a while, it actually will kill the grass, and you need to resod or reseed that area. It doesn't make any sense for any of these diseases to excavate the soil. Oftentimes I'll get calls and people are like, well, I'm going to dig 6 inches of soil out and bring in new soil and then put grass down. Well, the spores to these fungal diseases are airborne and waterborne. And so even, let's say you put in new soil that didn't have snow mold or summer patch or any of these diseases in there, is going to be there within a couple of weeks because these spores float around in the air. So, all right, animal urine blight. This is a problem if you have pets. So this I can tell is a male dog. The male dog seemed to do a little less damage. If that was a female, the grass would be dead in the middle. So urine has a little bit more salt in it, I guess, or at least the certain kinds of salts that does this. The way around this is to watch your dog go to the bathroom and just get your hose out and dilute that urine with water, and that generally it doesn't even show up. Sometimes people will use products that are specifically designed. Is Revive one of them, Mike? I believe there's a few of them out there that they're basically just surfactants that open the soil up a little bit more, like we already talked about. And so people will put that down in addition to watering it in. But generally, if you can when you let your pets out to go to the bathroom, you just water it in. Some other strategies, let's say you have outdoor pets, especially in the summer, you can train them to go to the bathroom in a certain area, and say you put gravel down or something, that can work. Otherwise, you just have these dead spots in your lawn, and eventually, they kind of move around with where the pets go to the bathroom, but they do go away as you irrigate and we get rain. Just another picture.
So, Tom,
Yeah, go ahead.
that Revive it's basically surfactants, so it just helps water to penetrate down through the thatch layer primarily, and iron. So,
Okay.
which honestly probably isn't super useful in our area since it's not the right kind of iron chelate.
Due to a lack of time, I took the iron out of the presentation, but grass doesn't need iron supplement until your pH is 8.
Yeah, grass does good with it. So it's just a surfactant, and really, Revive is kind of in that same vein as those liquid aerators, liquid aeration kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. Okay, mushrooms. People will jokingly or sometimes not jokingly say, "Are those edible?" And I'm not a trained mycologist, and I've talked to a couple of them. And what I understand is that you have a 1 in 3 chance of those being edible. So if you want to play some Russian roulette, just go ahead and eat the toadstools and mushrooms in your yard, and you have a third chance of being fine. So all you can really do is rake those off. I can already see in that turf that there's tons of thatch. The mushrooms grow where you have decomposing roots or lots of thatch, and they're really common when the soil is quite wet. And so you see lots of mushrooms during the spring and fall, or in shaded areas of the lawn, or if your lawn is overwatered. All you can really do with this is rake them off every few days. People will ask, well, can I use a fungicide? No, because those mushrooms are just the reproductive part of the actual organism, and oftentimes the fungi causing those mushrooms are 6 inches to a foot into the ground, depending on where the organic matter is, and so it's almost impossible to get a fungicide deep enough that it actually kill them. So the strategy is just to dry the area out between irrigations because they don't like dry soil, and just rake them off in the spring and fall. As the organic matter decomposes, they will eventually go away. Okay, other foliar diseases. During the summer, when we get really hot, and they're in the mid 70s during the night for extended periods of times, we have a lot of very uncommon fungal diseases kind of rear their ugly heads. And that's usually because we're irrigating at night when we're supposed to, and then we create really humid conditions, and it's warmer than usual, and it creates conditions that these fungal diseases will thrive. So some ways around this are to space your irrigations out again, a couple times a week. And then if you've had problems, schedule your irrigation so that it starts at about 4 in the morning and goes until 8 or 9, because when that sun comes up, it evaporates off the excess water and reduces the conditions that are conducive to these foliar diseases. Manage compaction and thatch also with them, and that will help. But otherwise, I think we're done. Are there any more questions?
None have come in that have been typed. Does anybody have anything they'd like to unmute their microphone and ask?
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, it's concerning area of lawn that is on the west side. It does get quite a bit of shade, but it also gets sun. And I have reseeded it for 2 years now, and, and actually put sod down as well in one area. And again, this spring, the lawn is not coming back very good. It's really patchy. But the weird thing is that the dirt on top is kind of broken up, almost like there, I don't know, my guess would be like, are there too many earthworms in that area?
What you're probably seeing is frost heaving as the ground freezes in the
Oh, yeah.
winter. The water, there's water and it has to go somewhere. So I don't think that has anything to do with it. The first thing I personally would do is have that soil tested by BYU or USU for salt or just salt and pH. And if there's low salt and there's not pH problems, that's going to be the cheapest thing you can do to eliminate those. But if you've reseeded a few times and had problem with the sod, the first thing I do is soil test. And once I know my soil is normal or not, that'll give me some direction to go with on the next step.
Because even if it had even dense shade, oftentimes the lawn will still grow, right?
Well, it will grow for a few years, but it's just this war of attrition to where it slowly starves to death. And what you would do is put that chewings or red fescue into that area and seed it in the fall or early spring. And if the fescue doesn't survive there, it's just way too shady.
Okay.
So
Okay.
my question is, how long ago did you plant the sod?
Well, I did a combination of sod and seed last year because I had a wedding here. And so, yeah, it's been a year now, but the sod's really thin.
So how many hours of sun do you suspect that it gets in that area?
Maybe 3, maybe 4, 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
But that would be spotty sun a little bit.
Yeah, that's probably would be my initial suspicion as well, is not enough sun.
Sun, okay. That's
Especially for those highlight intensity grasses that you've got. So really they'd probably do a lot better if they had at least 6 hours of direct sun.
Yeah. Okay, good insights, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. How do you smooth out a bumpy lawn?
I took the picture out, but I've got one from a presentation. There was someone's actually steamrolling their lawn. Steamroller has an American flag on it, so it makes it okay. That's the last thing you want to do. The bumpy lawns are oftentimes they could be that the lawn wasn't leveled correctly when you first planted, but if it showed up after the fact, then it's not usually, but oftentimes overwatering, and earthworms are surfacing and they stay in the top couple inches of soil because there's not enough oxygen deeper down.
So I would add to that overwatering and or compaction. So when you water, what we recommend is put down about a half an inch of water every time you irrigate, and then just change the number of irrigations per week. So say in July, you might need to water every other day at a half an inch of water. But what we're trying to do is put down a good amount of water and get it all the way through the root system down, 8 to 12 inches or so, and then letting it dry out. And so whether you've got compaction that's restricting that, or just simply the irrigation practices are a little bit lacking. But a lot of it's earthworm problems, and the reason they're near the surface is just oxygen availability. So if you can increase oxygen availability in the soil through getting water to penetrate completely down, and then the soil drying out, and compaction relief, most of the time those problems resolve themselves. Anything else?
So we did have somebody follow up with an hour's questions, and if you weren't here at the first, we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do about that with everything being temporarily shut down. it might be that we give everybody, if we can't do hours like we would have, we will defer until next year, or we'll figure something else out. But Mike and I need to speak about it further, and we actually probably need some input from campus before we make a final decision.
So
What is the,
just quickly, oh,
go ahead.
go ahead. Just
Oh, I
quickly,
saw a question. Yeah.
there was a lot of questions that I tried to field that were relating to irrigation, and we didn't have time to put that all in here, but I did put on the chats some links to the Seawell website, the Qualified Water Efficient Landscape website that USU manages. It's part of a training program, but it has some homeowner links in there as well on how to do these water checks and how to do those more specifically, and then looking at the WaterWise or the Slow the Flow website on when to, like, how to schedule irrigation. And there's actually a live link that the Natural Resources Department actually maintains during the summer based on temperature in the area as to how often they recommend irrigating your lawn. So just basically in April, just a rule of thumb, in April, typically one irrigation is usually sufficient. And then in May, it's like every 7 days. And then in June, it starts to go up to every maybe 2 days or so. Then July and August, it's about every other day. And then when we hit September, it goes back to about every 5 days. So we water for the same amount of time. You just change the number of days in between based on the seasonal temperatures. And that's a rough guide, but that's available online, or if you look at the Seawell website and the links that I put in the chat. And what else did you have, Tom?
You answered it. That was the last question. What's the best recipe for watering?
Okay, well, I think we're done then.
Okay, I guess we'll reconvene this afternoon around 6. So,
Yep.
thanks,
We'll see
everyone.
you guys later. Thank you.